Thank you for joining us for Sermons on Demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. We provide these videos as a way to share the pulpit messages and teachings offered at Friendship Grace Brethren Church. If you find these videos a helpful resource, please drop us a note at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com. Now open your Bibles and get ready to dig into the Word of God.
We continue in our study of the book of Acts this morning. You remember the book of Acts, title of the series is Beginning the Journey. We began chapter 18 last week, and in the first section of chapter 18 we saw the Apostle Paul in Corinth, remaining 18 months there. He planted the church and remained 18 months. We believe Paul was in Corinth from about the fall of 50 AD until the spring of 52 AD. So he's there a year and a half. And these 18 months were not always good for Paul. Things were not always perfect for him there. The Jews had rejected the message that he brought to them. He had spent some Friday nights, Saturdays in the synagogue teaching and preaching, and they just blatantly rejected it. And so he said, fine, listen, I'm done. I'm going to the Gentiles. And he goes right next door to the synagogue, and he sets up shop in the house of Titius Justus. That had to be a source of frustration. I can't imagine what that would be like to see that happen. But the Jews weren't happy with it, and some of the Gentiles weren't happy with it. But Jesus encouraged Paul to remain faithful and to continue in the mission in Corinth, because Jesus had many people in the city. We talked about that last week, what that could mean, and I think it means that he had lots of people that were going to be saved in the city by the ministry of Paul. So keep doing your ministry. Despite being in Corinth for 18 months and focusing his attention on the Gentiles, the Jewish leadership was looking for a reason to get rid of Paul. They wanted to go after Paul. They wanted him to be removed. So they were looking for some legal way to do it. They couldn't, think about it. They couldn't argue with Paul on the sense of spiritualness. They couldn't have philosophical discussions, spiritual discussions with him. Paul just ran circles around them. So they had to look for some other way. And so they were looking for some legal way. That catches us up to where we are this morning. The title of my message this morning is The Goal and Mission of the Church. We're going to be looking at the passage that we just read from chapter 18, starting in verse 12. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. We know from extra-biblical sources that Gallio becomes proconsul in Achaia on July 1st, 51 AD. We know this from several good documented Roman sources. So we have a pretty good timetable of what's going on. The Jews recognized they couldn't beat Paul in discussion, in debate, so they went after him legally. The Roman proconsul was the representative of the council. Not council, S-U-L, council. The council was the highest elected position in the Roman Republic, and then became the most important position other than the emperor in the Roman Empire. So if you were a council, what we would today call the Senate, the Roman Senate, if you were one of them, you had lots of authority. A proconsul was typically a retired consul who was a representative of a council. So it's like they carried the same weight. They had them stationed all over the empire as representatives of the government in Rome. Sovereign representatives of the government in Rome. So Gallio becomes the council, the highest elected or non-elected position in the Roman government. He becomes that in the summer of 51. Apparently the Jewish leadership felt that it was really important Now that they had a different ruler, proconsuls typically served a period of a year. So at this time, there's a change. Maybe they had tried with the previous proconsul, and he just said, "Listen, I'm not going to listen to you." Gallio becomes the proconsul, and he said, "We got to move now." And so they have a united attack against against Paul. Dr. Luke describes taking him before the tribunal. These pictures are pictures of what remains of the tribunal. Anybody care to guess what the word is for tribunal, the Greek word is for tribunal? It's a word you all know. Say it again. No, not tribe. Bema. Bema seat. We think of the Bema seat of Christ. The Bema is the judgment seat. It was where the council sat and ruled and made legal decisions. Made decisions for what would go on in the province that he ruled. These are the ruins of the tribunal or Bema seat in Corinth as they stand today. Yeah, it had been closed for a number of years and has just recently been reopened to limited, because it's kind of fragile, so it's open to limited tourist attraction. So the closest thing we would have today to the Bema seat would be like our United States District Court judge. Not quite the high court, but not the lower courts either. There was somebody above the proconsul you could appeal to. There's somebody above the federal district court bench that you can appeal to, and that would be the Supreme Court. So the U.S. District Court is about but they have more power than what our courts do. Our courts can only respond to things that are brought to them. They can't inject themselves in things they don't have actions in. But the proconsul could. He could do whatever he wanted. He was sovereign. And that's where there was a united. It was almost like it's a conspiracy. When I was studying this and I looked up the word united, the united attack, it was like they all got together and said, "This is what we're going to do." This was a concerted effort by the Jewish leadership to get rid of Paul. This was not just a simple lawsuit. This was a concerted effort to do whatever they could to get rid of Paul. So they bring him to this tribunal, and they say, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." These were the charges that the Jewish leaders brought. By AD 51, Rome was fully ensconced in its empire. It was no longer a republic. That ended a little bit before Jesus' time. It was now the empire. The emperor was a god. And everybody had to worship the emperor and the gods that he selected. Of course, he was very clear that he wanted to select all the gods because he didn't know which god would get him. But you had to worship the emperor and his chosen God. So to espouse to anyone that they should worship any other god would be treason. To lead a group of people that were treasonous, it would be insurrection. Not what our politicians are talking about today, happened January 6th. They're talking about what would be treasonous and actually guilty, if found guilty, punishable by death. Because you were bringing insurrection against the government of Rome. That's what they were accusing Paul of doing. Because Paul was teaching the gospel message. Jesus the Messiah, the future king of Israel. Well, that's in conflict with the emperor of Rome. Now look at verse 14. But when Paul was about to open his mouth, I love how Dr. Luke sometimes is very understated. As Paul was about to open his mouth, you know Paul was prepared to give a response. As he was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or a vicious crime, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint. But since it's a matter of questions about the words and names of your own law, see to it yourselves, I refuse to be a judge on these things." And he drove them from the tribunal. So Paul is there being accused of insurrection, being accused of being a treasonist, and he's about to answer when Gallio, the way it pictures, I don't know if this is the way it happened, but this is the way I pictured it in my mind. The charges are made, and Paul's about to I got this. You can see Gallio up there on the bema seat, and Paul's about to, I got this, just be quiet. And he says, look, you're not talking about anything that's a violation of my rights, my law. This is all your stuff. In other words, he didn't believe that what Paul was doing was in conflict with the Roman law. Some scholars, historical scholars, have said this was the turning point that would eventually lead to Christianity being legal. Remember, it's not legal yet in Rome. And it wouldn't be legal for another couple hundred years. But many point to this being the point where Rome began to look a little more favorably on the church. I think it's probably premature to say that because you also have the rule of Nero and so forth, and that was very much anti-church. Whether Gallio recognized Paul was what he was preaching and teaching was legitimate or not, we don't know. What we do know is Gallio prevented Paul from speaking about it there in the court. He said, look, you don't need to defend yourself. I'm dismissing the case. There's nothing going on here. He said, this is just a debate about your Jewish stuff. It has nothing to do with Rome. So Gallio told the Jews to deal with it on their own. He was not going to get involved with it. And then he threw them out. And when you look at that, verse 16, and he drove them from the tribunal. This is where, in our modern court we have bailiffs. This would be the bailiffs going and not just telling them to get out. This would be grabbing them by the collar and dragging them out. This is not okay, dismissed, everybody get out. This is dismissed, everybody get out, and drag them out. That's how forceful this is. But Gallio said, look, I got nothing to do with this. Here's your first question for the day. Where have we previously seen this kind of response by a Roman representative? Pilate, exactly. What did Pontius Pilate do when Jesus stood before him and the Jews were complaining that he's an insurrectionist? I got nothing to do with this. It seemed like the Roman line was, we don't want to get involved in these matters of spirituality. We've got our gods to deal with. We don't want to deal with that insignificant thing, is what they thought. He didn't want to get involved with Jesus. Pontius Pilate didn't want to get involved with Jesus, and Gallio doesn't want to get involved with Paul. I wonder, as Paul was there, and he was listening to Gallio, and Gallio said, look, this is not a matter for me to discuss. This is not a matter to come before me. I wonder if Paul was thinking, that's what Pontius Pilate did. That's the way Jesus was treated. I wonder if Paul was thinking, what happened to Jesus just happened to me. That had to be a humbling experience for Paul. Paul had to be thinking, remember, I think Paul was part of the Sanhedrin at the time Jesus was charged. I think Paul was part of the group making the charge against Jesus and watched Pilate do that. And now how the tables have been turned. It had to be a humbling experience for Paul, but I think it was also an encouragement for Paul to keep up with the ministry. Remember, Jesus had told him, Jesus appeared to him in a dream and said, listen, I got lots of friends here. I've got lots of people here. You've got a mission to accomplish. It had to be an encouragement for Paul to continue that mission. But the fight by the Jews wasn't over yet. Look at verse 17. And they seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention. Sosthenes, we'll discover, is the ruler or president of the synagogue. We had seen last week, Crispus was the ruler of the synagogue. Now we're nearing the end of the 18 months. Maybe there's a new president of the synagogue, because Crispus became a believer. So I imagine the Jewish leadership said, well, you can't lead the synagogue if you're going to follow Jesus. And Sosthenes becomes the leader of the synagogue. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 1:1 that Sosthenes aided him in writing the letter to the Corinthians. So maybe Sosthenes also becomes a follower of Jesus. When you look at this verse, and they seized Sosthenes, you got to figure out who is they. It's not real clear. And Greek scholars are all over the map on who they refers to. Many scholars argue that Gallio's official hands-off religious disputes were interpreted by the Gentiles as permission to go after the Jews. In that case, the they would be Gentile leadership in Corinth. Since they were taking up the court's time with this nonsense, they figured, we're going to go after the Jews. That's what some argue. Others argue that they is a reference to the Jewish leaders who beat up one of their own, Sosthenes, the president of the temple. They argue that as the ruler of the synagogue, he was the chief spokesman, the one that was bringing the charges to Gallio. And since that went up in flames, they said, well, we're just going to beat you. We got to get a pound of justice somehow. Gallio or others believe that what was going on was a combination of people, that people were thrown out physically from the tribunal, and so they just had a riot. And Sosthenes got beat up. I don't really know which way to come down on this. It's not clear. It doesn't really change the narrative much. Who did what here? But what's important is Gallio witnesses it. He's sitting up there on the bema seat, and he sees what happens, and he doesn't intervene, and he doesn't even care. I got nothing to do with this. You guys do what you guys are going to do. After this, Paul stayed many days longer, and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria. And with him Priscilla and Aquila, and at Cenchrea, he had his hair cut. He cut his hair, for he was under a vow. I would like for Dr. Luke to be a little more definitive in some statements. Dr. Luke says that Paul stayed many days longer. I don't know how many days he stayed. We know he was in Corinth a total of 18 months. Did this happen at the beginning of Gallio's time there? Did it happen later? I don't know. But he stays a while longer. Paul's not forced out of town. But at some point, Paul's ready to leave Corinth. He's ready to get back on the move. And so he goes down to the southern port of Corinth, Cenchrea. Remember, Corinth is on that narrow isthmus, a little less than 4 miles apart, and it has a northern port and a southern port with a road in between. Rather than sail around Greece, they would offload, put them on carts, roll them down the road to the southern port or the opposite way, and put them on other boats. Paul went to the southern port to catch a ship here in the southern port, and then he sailed over. This is Greece over to what is today modern Turkey. He was looking for a ship to take him to Syria. He was ready to conclude his second missionary journey. And he was ready to get to the church in Antioch, the sending church. Dr. Luke tells us that at the port of Cenchrea, Paul ended a vow that he'd been keeping. We're not given specifics on the vow, but most scholars believe the vow was a Nazirite vow. The Nazirite vow prohibited cutting the hair for the entirety of the vow, however long you had the vow. The hair would be saved, kept, and then when you got to the temple in Jerusalem, offered as a burnt sacrifice. You can go to Numbers chapter 6 to see more about the Nazirite vow if you desire. Some scholars argue that the vow was a different kind of vow. There are some scholars that argue that Paul had made a vow, a sinful vow. I don't really know how they got to that place where that's what they were thinking. But it was Charles Barnhouse, a well-known theologian of the 1900s, believes that while fighting with the Jewish leaders, Paul, in his despair, took a vow to demonstrate his ability to keep the law. Remember, we'll see that again, that kind of thought process again in chapter 20 of Acts. If you're doing your daily readings, you read that this morning, that Paul was encouraged by the leadership in Jerusalem, take a vow. Let them see you're still a Jew. So all these allegations of you leading people not to be Jews can be put to bed. Charles Barnhouse says that's what Paul was doing here, and that he did it out of frustration, did it out of anger. There's nothing in the text that would lead you to that. I think Paul routinely had a Nazirite vow. This is not the only time we see Paul talking about vows. Remember, Paul didn't stop being a Jew. He always was a Jew. He remained a Jew. He remained a practicing Jew, as did all of the apostles. I think this was just part of his normal custom. Paul's ready to leave Corinth, and he takes with him a couple that was living there in Corinth that he'd been working with. He'd been actually living with them, Priscilla and Aquila. They had come from Rome and were living in Corinth, and they left with him. And they came to Ephesus, and he left them there, but he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay a little longer, he declined, but on taking leave of them, he said, I will return to you if God wills, and he set sail from Ephesus. I said earlier that sometimes Dr. Luke doesn't give us all the detail we want. This is another time when I wish Dr. Luke would. He's a great historian, but I want more detail here. I want to know more about what was going on. I want to know why Priscilla and Aquila traveled with Paul and why they stayed in Ephesus. Was there a decision to plant a new church in Ephesus and to leave them there to help lead that church? You know that Ephesus would become one of the most significant churches in church history and would lead, the Apostle John would end up there, we believe, with Mary, the mother of Jesus, live out their lives there in Ephesus. It became a central hub of activity in what today is Turkey. So was the plan for Priscilla and Aquila to lead that church, to begin the church? We don't know. They clearly had experience and they clearly had knowledge, but we don't know how the decision was made. We don't know who made the decision. We just know that there they went. So Paul and the team get on a ship in Cenchrea and travel across the Aegean Sea to the port of Ephesus in modern Turkey. Nothing is said about Timothy and Silas. They were with them in Corinth, but again, no detail about that. Timothy will factor into the account later on, into the narrative more. We'll see Timothy again. We don't see Silas again. Why? I don't know. I want more detail. Dr. Luke doesn't give it to us, so we don't know. Paul says goodbye to Priscilla and Aquila and goes into the synagogue. We do know that Priscilla and Aquila stay 5 years in Ephesus. But that's all we know. We saw in Corinth and in every other city Paul traveled to that he would first go to the synagogue. He'd first go to the synagogue where people were listening and following or wanting to know about Jehovah God, both Jews and Gentiles. So that's where he'd begin. Even though he was only in Ephesus for a short time, he does the same thing here in Ephesus, and he spends some time there. The Jews in Ephesus said, "Hey, Paul, stick around for a while. We want to know more. Let's have more conversation." He said, "No, I got to get going. Time's up. I got to get to Jerusalem. I got to get there." Paul said he would be back if the Lord wills. And when he had landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and then went down to Antioch. Remember the vow Paul had taken? That he had his hair cut? I think verse 22 reveals to us that it really was the Nazirite vow because he wanted to get to Jerusalem. So here's your second question. How do I know that he wanted to get to Jerusalem? How do I know he wanted to get over there to Jerusalem? Put the verse back up so you can see it. When he landed at Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and then went down to Antioch. How do I know he went to Jerusalem? But it isn't. Actually, quite a bit out of the way. You like doing that. I like it. Well, Caesarea is north of Jerusalem. Antioch is north of Caesarea. You're on the right path, though. The word up is factored in there. You always go up to Jerusalem. Every reference to traveling to Jerusalem is going up. So, Dr. Luke doesn't need to tell us that when they landed at Caesarea, by the way, that's Caesarea Maritima. It's on the northern coast of Israel on the Mediterranean. Beautiful city. Beautiful harbor. I love Caesarea. About 70 miles or so to walk from the coast up to Jerusalem. And then he went to Antioch. So he walks 70 miles or so from Caesarea to Jerusalem, spends a little time there, I would guess, offers a sacrifice of his hair, and then goes up to Antioch, or goes down to Antioch. Antioch being north of Caesarea, in the middle of what is today Lebanon. So Jerusalem is not on his way geographically, but on his way purposefully. But again, Dr. Luke doesn't tell us a lot. Dr. Luke, please, tell me more. I want to know more of what's going on here. Which leads me to my next question. Why do you suppose that Dr. Luke chose to be so brief in the description of the end of the second missionary journey? When Paul gets to Antioch, missionary journey 2 is over. And it comes to a close with no fanfare, with nothing being said hardly. Why is Dr. Luke so brief in this? By the way, these questions are designed to make you think. How am I doing? Why doesn't he talk about it a lot? The first missionary journey he talks about quite a bit. But on this one he doesn't. Maybe nothing really happened at that point, but we know a lot did happen. Okay, it had nothing to do with his missionary. So Dr. Luke doesn't tell us much because it wasn't Paul that was doing it? Is that what you're saying? Okay. He's not doing it as a missionary. I had not considered that one. That's an interesting thing. I have to go back and really ponder that for a while. Well, that's the start of the third missionary journey. Dr. Luke gets really brief here. I don't know if Dr. Luke was in a hurry at this section. I don't know. But he's really brief in how he discusses things. Read out of the paper. As I looked at this passage, the very first thing I noticed is how brief Dr. Luke is in describing the trip from Corinth to Antioch. A brief stop in Ephesus, a city that would eventually become a major Christian hub. A trip to Jerusalem with no detail other than greeting the church there. I mean, that's kind of remarkable. He went to Jerusalem where the church was founded, where the leadership, the majority of the leadership of the church resided. And Dr. Luke doesn't describe it at all. He greeted the church there. Because they're the sending church, right? That becomes very important. Remember that. He always reports to Antioch. And then no information about that report to Antioch. As Ann read in verse 23, the next point is he's going right on to the third missionary journey. Not the normal way that Dr. Luke writes. When biblical writers write differently than they normally do, there's a reason. And so the Bible scholar has the responsibility to look at it and say, well, what's the reason? Why does Dr. Luke, who's a great historian and can take chapters to describe a single incident, write about several incidents in a couple of verses? Yes? But he was still the historian that collected the data. Right. But even in the parts where he's not with them, he records it in detail. This is odd for Dr. Luke. But never fear. I have some answers. Notice what Dr. Luke specifically says as he's describing these events or situations. First, he says, even in haste to get to Jerusalem, Paul stopped in Ephesus to talk to the Jews in the synagogue. He wanted to get to Jerusalem. He had a timetable, but he stopped along the way. That's the first real point that he makes. Paul had his hair cut off to get it to Jerusalem for a burnt offering. Now we're surmising that. We're surmising that it was a Nazirite vow, but that makes sense. He had a purpose for getting there at a specific time. 3, Paul greeted the church in Jerusalem. 4, Paul went back to Antioch. Those are specific points he makes that have quite a bit of import for us. So I'm going to read the next question for you. Leave those on the board so that you can see them. Based upon these data points, what was the purpose of this conclusion of the second missionary journey? Now, I don't expect a long answer on this, but I want you to think about it for a bit. Based on these data points, in haste to get to Jerusalem, he still stopped in Ephesus. Paul had to get to Jerusalem to worship with his hair. Sounds weird to say it that way. Paul greeted the church in Jerusalem and then went back to Antioch. Here's what I think all of that means. Dr. Luke emphasized that the mission was always outreach. The mission for Paul was always outreach. It wasn't building numbers. It wasn't building buildings. It was outreach. The mission that he had was always outreach. Even when he was traveling from Corinth to Antioch, it was important to stop in Ephesus and give the gospel. It was important to worship in Jerusalem. Outreach was always at the top of the list. Paul never let the mission keep him from his own personal relationship with God. I said earlier that I think it was custom for Paul to have vows, the Nazirite vow. That was part of his relationship with God. Paul never let the mission, the busyness of the mission, keep him from his personal relationship with God. Paul was a lifelong Jew who now had a relationship with the Jewish Messiah. We know from Numbers 6 that the Nazirite vow was to show dedication to the Lord. Look at Numbers chapter 6, verses 1 through 3. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them when either a man or a woman makes a special vow, the vow of a Nazirite, the Nazirite vow, to separate himself to the Lord. He shall separate himself from wine and strong drink. He shall drink no vinegar made from wine or strong drink, and shall not drink any juice of grapes or eat grapes, fresh or dried." Why? Look at verse 2 again. A Nazirite vow to separate himself to the Lord. We discussed this in Sunday school. That's holiness. Paul's relationship with God was important to him. And so he took the Nazirite vow frequently, I would argue, so that he could reestablish or reaffirm his being dedicated to the Lord, his separatedness, his holiness before the Lord. Paul was, as a practicing Jew, demonstrating, I am a follower of God. I'm a follower of Jesus, the Messiah. That's his personal relationship with God he was working on. His busyness never got in the way of his relationship with God. The Messiah of the Jews wanted to have relationships like that. Paul's use of the Nazirite vow reflected that he was dedicated to serving Jesus in the mission given by Jesus to the apostles and the rest of the church. Paul had turned away from the Jews in Corinth, but he didn't stop being a Jew. He still practiced his religion. He still practiced his relationship with God. And people needed to know it. And he needed his personal relationship with God continuously built up. So he didn't let the busyness of the world stop that. I also see that it's important to communicate and cooperate between various parts of the body. Paul was never really a part of the church in Jerusalem. When he was in Jerusalem, he was trying to kill them. But now he was going there to worship and fellowship with them. He only visited them on occasion. But it was important for him to greet the church in Jerusalem before going back to Antioch, because they were an important part of the overall structure of the church. He'd been a pastor in Antioch. He was commissioned to missionary service in Antioch, but it was still important for him to go see James and the others in Jerusalem, to develop that relationship between churches, cooperating and not cooperating. It was important for them all to be brought together. It was also important for Paul to stay grounded and under the authority of the sending body. That's going back to Antioch. They were the sending body. They were the ones in charge of Paul. They gave him the authority. Spiritual group that would make sure that Paul and team remained properly teaching the truth of God in the gospel message. So how do I wrap all of this up? The Holy Spirit inspired Dr. Luke to write Acts, all of it, using his own style and his own way and his own mannerisms. Dr. Luke was a consummate historian. There's a narrative in every book of the Bible that contributes to the overall narrative of Genesis to Revelation. Dr. Luke may have been writing the narrative for one particular person, Theophilus, but it was much bigger than just for Theophilus. As we look at the Gospel of Luke, as we look at the book of Acts, we see the birth of the church. Not just Theophilus benefits from that, we all do. In many ways, the book of Acts shows us how the early church operated. It shows us how the early church was organized, how they cooperated together. It shows how the early church operated and how we should operate as a church today. The narrative in this pericope, in this passage, has several small, individually insignificant details. But when you weave them together, provides you with a much better picture of how the church operated and how Paul operated. The narrative gives us a much bigger picture of how Paul and his team worked and what was truly important for them. No matter what we do as a church, outreach has to be the number one mission. It has to be at the forefront. It is the mission that everything else we do supports. That gathering that you do, the gathering that will occur this evening as you bring friends in that may never darken our doors, but they'll have the chance to hear the gospel message. That's important. That's the number one thing we should be thinking about. We're also part of a much larger team of churches. It starts with other Charis Fellowship churches here in Florida, then in North America, and then in the rest of the world. Charis Fellowship started in Germany, came to North America, and basically ceased to exist in Germany until we started sending missionaries. And now the churches in other countries other than in North America far outweigh the churches in North America. The goal in the mission has always been to have the gospel message of salvation by grace, based on the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, at the forefront of the church. Everything that we do is to have that message proclaimed around the world. Paul and his team demonstrated that singular goal and mission. In order to be effective in that goal, we have to be dedicated, set apart to God. We have to work on our own personal relationship with God so that we have the ability to talk to others. I so enjoy my half hour or whatever it is in the morning. Maybe because I have my first cup of coffee for the day, but because I get to spend time alone and quiet with God. I have to work on my own relationship so that I'm able to work on relationships with others and help them see the gospel. Our cooperation with churches is bigger than just the Charis Fellowship, the Charis Alliance around the world. It's with other evangelical, like-minded churches. We all should have the singular focus of the gospel message. The mission is not to be entertainment. The goal is not to be a place that people find help for their felt needs. Because I'll guarantee you they don't feel like they need to know Jesus until the Holy Spirit calls them. The mission is to introduce them to Jesus. What better time to do that than at Christmas? Thank you, Father. Thank you for allowing us to see in your word the truth you want us to know. For what you want us to know about who you are, what you want us to know about the mission of serving you and following you and teaching others about you, about what you did on the cross for us, the life that we have because of Jesus. Thank you, Father. Thank you for loving us. Give us an opportunity today and every day to witness into the lives of people and introduce them to Jesus. Thank you for loving us, Jesus.
Thank you for watching or listening to this teaching on demand from Friendship Grace Brethren Church. please consider sending us an email at info@friendshipgracebrethren.com to let us know how this teaching may have helped you. Please also consider joining us in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church, located at 10251 Metro Parkway, Suite 116, Fort Myers, Florida, just south of the intersection of Metro and Colonial Boulevard. Sunday school begins at 9 and worship service at 10 a.m. We look forward to seeing you in person at Friendship Grace Brethren Church.